What's going on, guys? So today we're going to be talking about cylinder head gaskets for boosted motors and which one you guys should run on your boosted car depending on how you're assembling the motor. So we're going to be talking about the differences between the MLS gasket and a Cutring gasket, sort of the pros and cons of each under the running scenarios in which you would run one of these gaskets, and why I am switching from an MLS to a Cutring gasket for my turbo build. We're going to go into that a little bit later. Now, if you're looking into boosting your E36, this is sort of one of the things that you need to address. You need a new head gasket and you need new head bolts, and this is going to be the one you're going for, ARP head studs. I don't really know if there's another company that makes head bolts, stronger head bolts like this. ARP is really the main one to go to. And then you'll see a debate between these two gaskets on really which one you should run. So bare minimum for boosting, you want to upgrade the head gasket and the head bolts because the factory equipment is not strong enough to handle good boost pressures. So this is an MLS gasket. For those of you guys who don't know, this stands for multi-layer steel. Now this head gasket is made, as it sounds, of multiple layers of steel that is cut out in the shape of a head gasket. And from what I've heard and what I've read, they are stronger than a Cutring gasket simply because the entire thing is made of steel. That being said, I have seen builds that run over 1,000 horsepower on Cutring gaskets. Like if you're going for insanely high horsepower numbers, then you would want to run an MLS. But if you're going to be running just basically any boost level up until like it gets stupid, the Cutring is going to be fine. I've never read a thread that someone switched from a Cutring to an MLS because the Cutring fails. Usually turbo systems on these cars fail for some other reason than the head gasket. I've never seen some guy just like, my whole turbo build failed because the head gasket blew. You'll see a lot of these get bad reviews because they have a reputation for not sealing properly. Now what I mean by that is the head gaskets will tend to leak. Compression, leak oil, leak coolant, whatever. And VAC, the company that I bought this from, claims that under proper install circumstances, these gaskets don't leak. And I believe them. This gasket does require very specific conditions in which it will seal. Properly, that is. To run one of these gaskets properly, you need to have your cylinder head finished, machined with a 50 RA finish at least, and you have to have that same finish on the block. Now if you think you can get even close to a 50 RA finish with a razor blade, a brass brush, and a piece of sandpaper by sanding your block down, you're totally wrong. You're not even going to get close. So in order to get your block to a 50 RA finish to properly run this head gasket, you need to have that block on a lathe and getting cut. Now what that means is that metal shavings, when they cut, is going to be everywhere, so you're going to have to hot tank the block, which means that your pistons and rods and all that good stuff cannot be in the block. Not to mention the timing cover has to be on, but the timing guides have to be off, otherwise you'll cut right through them. And since you're tearing down the motor that far to cut the block, might as well throw new rings and bearings in because it's going to be out anyway, and because the oil pump is not going to be in because that's how you have to have it. You have to have the oil pump off to set it up on the lathe. Basically the block's going to be just a bare block all the way torn down. And now you're not just replacing a head gasket, you're doing a full motor rebuild. So that basically means if you want to run an MLS gasket properly, you do need to do basically a full engine rebuild. Now if you're going to tear your block down that far and reuse rings and reuse bearings, that's kind of really bad form. If you are planning on doing a full motor rebuild, then you can run an MLS gasket. Now if you are just pulling your cylinder head to replace the head gasket, I would not run an MLS gasket because you cannot get the surface prepped well enough to run one of these. So basically you have to machine your block, and to do that the block's not going to be in the car and the block has to be completely torn down, so you're not doing a head gasket job anymore, you're rebuilding the engine. Which is kind of where this MLS gasket falls on its face. A lot of guys that I've seen that have leaking issues have just pulled their cylinder head with the bottom end still in the car, cleaned it up, threw one of these gaskets on, and then it leaks because they didn't prep it properly, and now they have a bad reputation for leaking because the guy didn't install it properly. You see what I mean? So that's where the MLS gasket sort of falls on its face. Now, I could run an MLS gasket. I am doing a full motor rebuild, so I can and have the ability to get my block to the proper RA finish in order to run one of these gaskets. And that's where the Cutring head gasket is going to come into play. Now, this cylinder head gasket does not require the same conditions in order for it to seal properly. You do not have to machine your block to run one of these gaskets, and that's kind of the beauty of it. You can run one of these gaskets just by pulling the cylinder head off, cleaning the block, and slapping this thing together, and that's where these guys really shine. So if you are going to be boosting your motor and you are not going to be rebuilding the motor, you're not going to be pulling the block out, you're just going to be pulling off the head to install new head bolts and a head gasket, Cutring is going to be the way to go. Now basically, I'm not going to open this up to show you guys, these little steel rings inside of this gasket are actually not part of the material. So if I were to open this up, the gasket would be one thing, and then you would have 6 steel rings like this. And these rings have tiny little grooves in them that were literally cut into the metal casting of the cylinder head to provide a better seal. Usually with a factory head gasket, that seal is made just simply by the cylinder head crushing the gasket between the block and the head to provide that seal. These will actually cut in and provide a better seal. So it's not just the clamping force alone on the cylinder head bolts, it's the clamping force and the fact that these are cutting into the cylinder head that give you a good seal. Now another thing to note, if you're going to be just installing a Cutring gasket and the ARP head bolts with the block in the car, you're more than likely going to be running the stock bottom end. Now, in order to do this properly to boost it, you will need to run a copper head gasket spacer. CES sells them alongside with, you can actually get a combo pack. You can get the Cutring gasket and the spacer as like one kit, and I think they even sell the gasket, the spacer, and the head bolts as another kit. And the reason you need to do that is to lower the compression ratio. So I'm not going to get too far into detail about lowering compression ratios to help boost turbo. If you run the same compression ratio and you boost it, you might run into knocking issues. So lowering the compression will actually allow you to run more boost and more power without running into the knocking issue. I'm not going to get too far into it, just know if you're going to be boosting on a factory bottom end, you will need to get a spacer, a copper spacer to run with it in order to lower the compression. And so that's the main differences between the MLS and the Cutring gasket, is the fact that you can run the Cutring gasket without having to pull the block completely apart. You can run one of these just by pulling the head off, cleaning it, slapping the spacer, this guy, and the head bolts on. You're good to go. You don't have to pull the whole motor. Now, I am doing a full motor rebuild, and I initially was planning on going with an MLS gasket. That being said, I'm switching to a Cutring gasket for a couple of reasons. The first reason is I bought the MLS gasket before I bought the pistons and before I figured out how the whole bottom end assembly was going to go together. So I actually bought the wrong one. This MLS gasket is for a factory S52, so it's an 86.4 millimeter bore. I'm running 85 millimeter pistons, so that head gasket is actually a little bit too big. So I had to get one in 85 millimeters, the proper size. And when I was thinking about it, I decided to go with the Cutring. The Cutring gasket alone, compared to the MLS, is cheaper. This one was about 300 bucks. I think the MLS was about 500 bucks. But if you're getting a spacer with it too, they're basically the same price. So this head gasket is proper because it will fit. The other reason is because I am a sort of DIY channel. You guys know this. I like to do DIYs for you guys because you can leave the block in and boost a factory bottom end with this head gasket. I figured this would be a more useful DIY install for you guys installing a Cutring gasket than the MLS gasket would be. Again, because you have to completely tear down the block and machine it and basically rebuild the engine to run that MLS gasket properly, I figured someone who is going to be doing that already has the skills required. You know, if you're going to be speccing bearings and gapping rings and all that stuff, I'm sure the last thing you're going to be looking up is how to install a cylinder head, because you should sort of know it at that level. But for the weekend warriors who are just going to be pulling the cylinder head off, and this might be the first time that they're pulling the cylinder head off, I figured that a Cutring head gasket DIY install for you guys is going to be much more useful, again, because a lot more people run these gaskets, because the majority of the budget turbo builds don't typically have fully built bottom ends. They just pop the head off and slap one of these babies on there. So I figured it would be a much more useful DIY for you guys to be running the Cutring gasket. So that's why I'm switching to the Cutring gasket. So if you guys are wondering which gasket you should run, no rebuild motor, rebuild motor. Now another thing I would like to say is if you guys are building an NA motor, a naturally aspirated motor, the factory head bolts and head gasket are going to be more than capable of handling any bolt-ons, cams, exhaust, intake manifolds, even bigger injectors in a tune. The factory gasket is going to be strong enough to withstand that level of power. So if you're building an NA motor, you don't necessarily have to run ARP head bolts and a new head gasket. The factory equipment will be capable of handling what you can do to it. Alright, that is it. Thank you guys so much for watching. Keep it fresh, and I will see you guys later.
dreaming in the dark. We are nothing more than dust. Search but you stay lost. We are